Perfect.
Yes, we are now recording.
Great. Thank you all so much for coming. Just as a housekeeping reminder, if everyone could mute their lines, that's really helpful. It'll just help with kickback, because we do want to allow you guys to have control of your own lines so we can have a good input session halfway through this virtual meeting. So thank you. And really, I just wanted to say thank you all so much for tuning in, and a real genuine thank you to both Keith Brines, our town planner, and Susan Cullen, our director of economic and community development, for pulling all of this together, thanks to a grant we got from the state, and bringing in Dr. Donald Poland. We're really grateful to have your expertise with us here in Stonington. With that, I'll hand things over to the experts in the room. But again, just thank you so much, and we're really looking to hearing everyone's feedback on the call. Thank you.
Thank you, Danielle. Appreciate the kind introduction and look forward to this evening. So for those of you who don't know me, my name is Donald Poland. I am a planning consultant with the firm of Goman York based in East Hartford, Connecticut. And we've been working with town staff and the Economic Development Commission since October. All of our work up till now has really been research and technically oriented. And this is our first public meeting trying to engage the public for some public input into this process. So I just want to be clear as I move through these. I'm going to do a presentation that's probably going to take 20-25 minutes, and then we're going to open it up to the public and I'll try and engage you guys in some discussion. But I am going to get to a point in these slides where I end up showing kind of recommendations and so forth. Those are kind of the ideas that we're exploring at this point. But I want to be clear in that no decisions have been made on how we proceed from here. So I don't want you to take those recommendations as if they were preordained recommendations and so forth. They're to get ideas out in the community, to start a discussion, and ultimately refine and figure out what it is we're going to do. Also, please forgive me. I just lectured for 2.5 hours with a college class and my voice started fading at the end of that lecture. So if I'm clearing my throat, it's just due to I've been talking a long time today. So the aim of this presentation is ultimately to explore affordable housing in Stonington and engage the community in a conversation about the future of affordable housing in Stonington. To accomplish this, basically, this slide's going to run through some basic ideas. We're going to look at what is affordable housing, why affordable housing in Stonington, and why now. The Stonington housing study and plan that we are working on, I'll update you kind of in greater detail than I just did on where we are. And we essentially have produced 3 documents that I'll discuss later, but one of which is a housing needs assessment to determine the need for affordable housing, then possible strategies, and ultimately I will engage you guys in a community.
Sorry, if people can please mute themselves who aren't speaking.
Thank you. And ultimately engage you guys in a conversation about affordable housing. So I'm gonna have Keith launch some interactive polling questions that will be available, I believe, for those of you who are logged on online. I'm not sure that they're available to those on the phone. Essentially, the questions are as I am showing them here, and you'll have an opportunity to answer those questions. At the end of this presentation, I'm going to arrive at a very similar slide. And even though you have given answers to these questions as part of this poll, I will ultimately engage you in a discussion around these questions and will wander a bit away from them as needed. But it's just a way to kind of frame this, and it'll give you an opportunity to further explain kind of your static answers here. So with that said, I will proceed on So affordable housing, understanding and defining affordable housing. If you exist within the planning world as I do, or if you pay attention to kind of popular media, uh, it's pretty widely recognized that the United States has an affordable housing crisis, and Connecticut has an affordable housing crisis. That being said, the degree of kind of affordable housing crisis is going to vary depending on the regions of the state. So in New York City or San Francisco, or even a Boston, have a much more significant affordable housing challenge than, say, a southeastern Connecticut. But that doesn't mean that affordable housing is not a challenge for southeastern Connecticut. It's just not to the same degree as possibly other places. And then the challenges of affordable housing are going to differ across your region. So ultimately, we get down to kind of Stonington and affordable housing. So what is affordable housing? How's it defined? Essentially, the federal government, or HUD, set the standards decades ago, and they've been reaffirmed by research and studies that housing is deemed unaffordable when a household spends 30% or more of their income on housing. That's typically mortgage or rent, taxes, insurance, and utilities combined. Qualified affordable housing, or how we speak of affordable housing in the context of land use and land use planning, is housing units or households that receive government assistance or are deed restricted to be sold or rented at below prices for which a household pays 30% or less of their income. In Stonington, based on the State Department of Housing and what's called the 8-30G housing affordability list, 5.93% of your housing stock is deemed affordable based on these definitions, or 561 housing units. By state definition, a community is supposed to have at a minimum 10% of their housing as affordable. So we see Stonington start to come into play here as not reaching that state mandate for 10%. For me as a planner, though, that in and of itself does not tell me that you need affordable housing. It's just one metric, one measure. So we went further, as I'll discuss later, and did a housing needs assessment to determine where your housing needs are for affordability. Qualified households, essentially in the context of qualified affordable housing, are households with incomes at or below 80% of median household income. So to put that in context, I show you here the median household income for Connecticut is $76,000, New London County $71,000, and Stonington $79,000. So you can start seeing that on an income level, you guys are tracking higher than both the state and the county. Affordable housing income at 80% AMI or less, I then show 80% AMI for Connecticut would be 60,000 or 61,000. New London County would be 57, and Stonington would be 63,000. I just want to be clear when we talk about this, because there's often a stigma with the idea of affordable housing. Incomes of 57 or 63,000 are not poor incomes. They're actually very middle class incomes. So even at 80% AMI, we're not necessarily talking about a poor population, even though we will be talking about lower percent of AMI as we move through this presentation. As part of this, we tried to kind of work on what we think are some strengths and aspirations and values of the Stonington community. I'm putting this out here as ideas, and then if you see down in the bottom right-hand corner, I say the bullet points are kind of first principles upon which we, the Stonington community, I always speak we with clients, and I'm part of this, should all agree. And then I asked, does anyone see them differently? But I think these are some core values around the community. That not only is Stonington a great place to live with its villages and seacoasts and rural farmland, it's also a diverse place to live. It's a welcoming community that cares for each other, creates a sense of belonging that is a substantial part of Stonington's character, who you are and how you view yourself. A community that values social, economic, and environmental diversity, and recognizing that social, economic, and environmental are kind of the three components to sustainability, which I'll talk about later. Residents enjoy a small town vibe with historic villages, maritime heritage, coastal setting, and scenic rural farm country. It's a community that wants to provide opportunities to persons of all incomes to enjoy and benefit to enjoy the benefits the community has to offer. My apologies there. It is important that Stonington's actions promote and celebrate diversity, ensuring persons from all walks of life can afford living in Stonington. I'll hold for later on the do you view this differently, if you'll just appease me and allow me to kind of run through the presentation, and we'll come back to talking about that. Who you strive to be, or who Stonington should strive to be. Yeah, anyone living in Stonington should have access to clean, safe, and quality affordable housing. I think this is key, is kind of, a human right, that you want your residents to be made whole through housing. That Stonington as a community and municipality seeks to provide housing that is affordable, such that those who work in Stonington, irrespective of income, can afford to live in Stonington. And our village centers should continue to offer inclusive mixed income housing close to shops and services where public transportation, utilities, water, and sewer are available. And I think this statement becomes key in the bigger picture of affordable housing in Stonington. So much of your community does not have access to the infrastructures required often for higher density housing development. Therefore, certain areas are more suitable from an infrastructure standpoint to such development. I think it's important that we confront kind of some affordable housing tropes straight on. There's often the NIMBY reaction. And I'm not someone, well, a lot of planners, or there's this common view that NIMBYs are bad. I understand why NIMBYism occurs. That property ownership, for many of us, is the largest purchase we ever make. We buy a property at a point in time for many reasons. Some are financial, some are personal, and we buy into a community at a point in time. So as humans, I think, we struggle with change. So whenever there's a development application, and whenever change is occurring, we react emotionally and we seek to protect our property rights. So NIMBYism in and of itself, I don't necessarily believe is bad. I think it is a human reaction. That being said, some of the tropes around affordable housing, things like buy or rent a home you can afford, or move to a community you can afford. I think often these kinds of ideas may get in the way of having a broader discussion about the importance of housing overall and the importance of providing affordable housing for all populations. That, as we kind of said on the prior slides with those values, there's persons of all economic levels already living within Stonington. How do we actually ultimately accommodate them? So are there things like stop making poor decisions or asking me to pay for them? We need to get beyond these, just visceral kind of statements and move towards a broader discussion and a broader understanding. And I think in Stonington, and what we've heard from some residents, what I've heard also from staff and so forth, is that there's often this concern about Pawcatuck and Pawcatuck getting saddled with affordable housing. So one, I think it's important for us to remember those principles of an inclusive, holistic community that's not just about the villages. Even though so many of us or so many of you identify with specific areas, I'm working in the community right now that I keep on laughing at them. They have 3 exit ramps off of I-84, and rather than saying I'm from Pawcatuck or I'm from Mystic, they say I'm 67, I'm 68, and I'm 69. That's how they identify their communities within the town. But I think at the end of the day, my point there, for them, they have to recognize they're all part of the same town. And the same is true for Stonington. Yes, you have those sub-identities of your villages, but you're still all part of Stonington, that you're a collective community. Also, I think it's important to keep in mind, especially when talking about a neighborhood and communities such as Pawcatuck, that investment in housing, regardless of whether it's affordable or not, and really investment in any real estate, whether it's commercial or residential, benefits the entire community. So being able to invest in a new housing stock or upgrade or update an existing housing stock to accommodate affordability still has tremendous economic benefits to a place like Pawcatuck or other locations within Stonington. And in addition, I also think it's important to recognize once again that at 100% AMI, is very much middle class incomes. At 80% AMI, we're still talking middle class incomes. And while I haven't had a chance to look at the data yet, I will be looking specifically at Pawcatuck. I would guess that 80% AMI probably trends very close to actual household income numbers in Pawcatuck. So we're not talking about something lesser. The definition of sustainability came about in the late 1980s and put forth by the UN and a special commission that met to look at the ideas of sustainability. And the recognized definition is development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. A lot of times people stop there, but I think the next sentence is important. To achieve sustainability, we must integrate and balance economic, environmental, and social goals. That sustainability can't be just about preserving the environment. It also has to be about economic viability and about social viability or social goals. So we always have to keep kind of those 3 legs of the stool in focus when discussing affordability, sustainability. And affordable housing is critical to that. So why affordable housing? Quality affordable housing provides social and economic stability for households, families, and communities. It's also, and especially in the work I often do around economic development, it's a key aspect of economic development. The fact is, homes are where jobs go at night. And if you don't have a housing stock to house your workforce, then business recruitment, business retention can be extremely challenging. And that's especially true in many resort communities. And not that everything about Stonington is a resort community, but you do have a robust tourism sector. And I've worked in a lot of tourism communities around the country. And there are communities, places like Park City, Utah, or Bar Harbor, Maine, that actually housing values are so high that the residents can afford to live there, but the workforce to sustain the tourism economy can't afford to live in those communities. So we need to be conscious of the relationship between housing, affordability, and economic development. Quality affordable housing is also key to social and economic prosperity. Diversity, social, economic, and cultural, is the cornerstone of resilience. The more resilient a community is, the more it can withstand shock and disturbance and change. I often point to West Hartford, Connecticut. It's a wealthy suburb of Hartford, or it has a reputation as a wealthy suburb of Hartford. But when you actually dig down and look at it closely, it actually has a very diverse set of communities and neighborhoods within it. And it has everything from the 900 square foot slab on grade 1940s, era housing to multifamily rental and ownership, all the way up to giant mansions. And the fact is, from a municipal fiscal perspective, West Hartford is a very resilient community based on its diversity. Past generations have also benefited from affordable housing and the associated wealth creation. My parents bought a 1,000 square foot single family house in 1971 for $27,000. My mom's still alive today, still has that house. It financed my sister and I going to college. And today the home is worth about $240,000. It's a tremendous portion of my mom's wealth in her old age. And we need to ensure that future generations have that also. And at the end of the day, when the market doesn't function, and those who know me, I'm a market guy. I want the market to function and solve problems. But when it doesn't, government has a role to play. Some refer to it as a social safety net. I just kind of refer to it as general responsibility. When the market doesn't work, government can and should intervene. So why now Stonington's housing affordability plan? One is our governor and our state legislature over the past, in recent years, have made ultimately affordable housing a priority, recognizing the affordable housing crisis on a national and state level. In 2017, the General Assembly passed a law that's now codified in statute that requires at least every 5 years each municipality prepare an affordable housing plan. And that's essentially what we're doing. It's based on that requirement in state law. And thankfully, the State Department of Housing provided grant funding that municipalities could apply for. And your wonderful staff sought out those funds and were able to secure a grant to pay for this study. So, and in October of last year, we started this process. We being myself, along with staff in the Economic Development Commission, and ultimately now with all of you drawing the public into this process. And since then, we've really been looking at the analysis, doing the research, crunching the numbers, looking at things like the zoning regulations and possible impediments to affordable housing, and also looking at other potential public policies moving forward that could better maybe encourage affordable housing. So 3 technical memos were produced, and they looked at land use regulations, the housing needs assessment, and ultimately potential incentives for affordable housing. I want to quickly bring you up to speed on the needs assessment. So first and foremost, in Stonington, 41% of renters and 29% of owners are cost burdened, which means they spend more than 30% of their income on housing. That starts to quantify the idea of need, that we know we have a burdened population that's spending a lot of money for the housing that they have. Now, we recognize some of that may be by choice. Person wants status, or they want a zip code or access to a school system. But for the vast majority of these individuals, it's actually just a factor of housing costing more than the income that they actually have to pay for it. The table up top really provides a summary of the housing needs assessment. Negative red numbers are where there are fewer housing units than there are households at that income level needing needing housing, affordable or not. So in the first row, the owner occupied, it's total households by income compared to owner occupied housing. So this is showing us a broad spectrum. I'm going to refine as we go through this. But here we see on the home ownership side, there's far fewer home ownership units that are affordable to lower income households. And to be honest with you, that's a finding I expect. Not everyone can afford home ownership. So I would expect to find a lot of negative numbers in the lower income cohorts. This line here is generally to represent median household income above and below. And what we also find comparing the homeowners is you actually have a lot of households with a lot more wealth than there are houses available for at the high end of the market, which is actually a strong number or a strong sign, even though it shows up as a negative. We then compared all households to renter-occupied housing. And what we find here is a substantial need at the lowest income cohorts, and also then in the middle income cohorts and going all the way up into the high income cohorts. Once again, this is kind of expected, but it's starting to show us maybe on the rental side need at this location and need in this location related to affordability. The last is the best comparison, but we need these to start understanding some of the dynamics, the first two. The last one, it's total households via income compared to total occupied housing or households. And here we see that the housing in the community is serving most incomes very well, from even low incomes in the 15 to 25,000 range, all the way up to $100,000. There are more housing units available than there are households. But it's at this lowest income level where there's still a substantial need. And once again, at these highest income levels, it's not a housing affordability problem. It's just there's households with a lot more wealth than the cost of housing, even at the top end in Stonington. What this says to me, because this isn't just about Stonington, we do have to consider affordable housing on the regional scale, is that you do have a need for affordable housing kind of at median household income and less, with the most substantial need here. The fact is, this income cohort is likely putting pressure on this income cohort, likely onto this one and down, making it tougher at these lower ends for quality affordability. So from this and from our analysis and review, these are essentially the broad categories of recommended strategies that we've landed upon at this part to further explore through this planning process. Regulatory revisions, and I'll talk more specifically about these on the next slide. Density and density bonuses, efficient permitting, permitting and fee reductions or waivers, property tax abatements, and the establishment of what's called a housing trust fund. The regulatory revisions are very kind of in the weeds, technical planning analysis of zoning based on my expertise, also your staff, and input from the Economic Development Commission, who's been kind of overseeing this process. But essentially, based on the work I do around housing and around zoning, I went through your regulations and said, what are the things in your regulations that probably create impediments or barriers to the creation of housing in general, with then also an eye to affordability? So you have a great accessory apartment regulation that's relatively new, innovative, and I believe supported by the community, but there's still some things in it that probably create impediments, like minimum square footage, size, and so forth. So we made some recommendations about how you could maybe tweak that to improve it. The same with duplex units. You kind of treat them differently than single family houses, and maybe they shouldn't be. Multifamily residential, your zoning regs avoid the phrase multifamily. You use this attached housing phraseology, but ultimately allowing more multifamily or attached housing in areas served by public water and sewer would probably be beneficial. In the specific regulations for that multifamily or attached housing, some of the minimum lot sizes are excessive. That kind of the lot sizes may double for every unit added, or that they're just an excessive high minimum lot size to begin with, or restrictions on height may prevent the number of units that can be constructed within a building that we say should be looked at. Minimum residential standards. This is common in a lot of communities that you say a residential housing unit can't be less than X number of square feet. My general feeling is the state building code handles that. It sets minimum, what is a minimum square footage for a habitable unit. And therefore, we shouldn't be redundant with zoning, and we really shouldn't have more restrictive minimums in zoning. Mixed use development, you do have regulatory provisions that allow for mixed use in some areas. Your neighborhood housing development zone is a really good mixed use, has a good mixed use provision. But overall, there are some kind of aspects of your typical mixed use, not the neighborhood development zone, that need some tweaking or changes to make it a more viable option. And from my perspective, I think there's some areas in the community, especially up along exit 90 and exit 92, if you didn't pick up on that in the polling questions that were asked or that we'll discuss further, that really open themselves up to being viable locations for mixed-use developments. And a regulation better orientated towards that would better encourage it. Parking standards in some instances are excessive and can be a barrier to housing development. The more parking you require, the less room there is for housing, or you chew up a lot really quickly with a lot of parking. And the fact is, our household sizes have been declining. We don't need as much parking as we previously assumed we did. And then some other aspects of the R10 zone and non-conforming lots, and maybe some opportunities for infill development if changes were made in the regulations. So this first one on recommended incentives, density and density bonuses, this all relates back to that prior slide on zoning, making regulatory improvements to better encourage housing and affordable housing, and maybe the creation of specific zoning to encourage affordable housing in suitable locations. Efficient permitting, as I already mentioned, reducing the reliance maybe on special permits for housing. And then permitting fee reductions and waivers. Permitting fees, your guys' fees are fairly reasonable. They're not overly excessive, but fees on land use applications have been increasing in recent years and actually can be burdensome to the overall financial feasibility of development. So the recommendation here is considering when affordable housing is put forward, providing either reductions or waivers in the permitting fees for those units or the development overall. Property tax abatements, as I think were engaged in the recent wind development in town, have become more and more common with housing. I remember just 10 years ago, communities only utilized tax abatements for commercial development. It's now become common for residential development, especially multifamily residential. There's the realization or the connection to economic development, the realization in government that we need workforce housing if we're going to retain and attract jobs, but also just the fact that the high cost of construction in Connecticut has made it really challenging to make developments financially feasible. And therefore, communities like Wethersfield, West Hartford just did their first tax abatement ever, Bloomfield, Manchester, Glastonbury. Communities across the state are starting now to use tax abatements as a way to incentivize multifamily residential development. And in West Hartford's case, to incentivize that 20% of the housing units in a development be affordable. And then the Housing Trust Fund is actually a budgetary fund, a municipal fund that government can set up to fund housing, specifically affordable housing. And you can be very creative in how this is used. There could be a budgetary line item for the trust fund every year, $50,000 or $100,000 to go towards housing and affordable housing. You can capture permitting fees for housing and place them into the trust fund to be used on future developments. Or you can actually, because charitable donations can be made to a municipality, you could even fundraise in the community to raise funds for the housing trust fund and providing the tax benefit to the donor as a means of doing it. So this returns me to the questions, which hopefully you've had the opportunity and that our technology worked to answer those. Smile from Keith would be helpful. But if not, now's your chance, or at least a chance for me to discuss affordable housing with you, engage you in the conversation, think about some of these questions in these locations and other questions that you may have of me that you'd like me to answer. So if possible, I'd love to hear what the community has to say.
Well, let me say, fortunately, that what I saw, the option I had before to open poll questions is just gone now. So
Okay.
poll questions have not been up.
Okay. Well,
And I also thought I'd be opening it later.
Okay.
So I haven't been dealing with it.
Okay, that's fine. Then we can just do these questions verbally without the polling. The first one's kind of straightforward, and I really don't want to pick on people. Yes or no, do you support this? Was a nice polling question. But I'm really interested in hearing your thoughts, especially from a land use perspective, on these 4 areas or other areas in the community that you think may be suitable for affordable housing. I believe that there is a raise hand function in WebEx, or I also believe you can politely unmute and start to speak, and hopefully we don't talk all over each other. We'll try and manage this. So does anyone, oh, go ahead, Keith.
Yeah, just I was just going to say something similar, just that if people can unmute themselves, whether on a telephone or a computer. It is more difficult if you're on a regular old telephone. So I'm just going to unmute, or try to unmute, all the people on the telephone. So.
Thank you, Keith. Anyone want to jump in and start with thoughts on kind of exit 90 or exit 92 as potential areas for either multifamily development or mixed use development? Wow, you guys are no different than my students.
Hello, it's Ben. Go
ahead.
Yeah, I had a more general comment I'd like to address if nobody else is speaking.
Sure.
It seems to me that what we're really talking about with affordable housing is integration. It's integration of economic groups. And I would like to bring up, what I see the biggest problem, and I believe that needs to be addressed in any affordable housing plan is really racial integration and our history in this country of discrimination and access to financing and housing based on racial lines. And that history is what's responsible for the patterns, the neighborhood patterns that we see today that we're trying to correct. So I feel that any plan to address affordable housing should first and foremost address racial segregation. That's about it. Thanks.
Well, that's not about it. That's actually a great and powerful point. First and foremost, my education and my experience have taught me we segregate economically first and foremost. But in the American experience and the urban experience, as you have explained, there is also racial segregation. And much of it, through past and even present practices, has been encouraged, if not required, by government. So, as you noted, access to mortgages and financing historically, not as much today, but there are still, it's not legal under fair housing and equal housing opportunities, but such practices do still occur. Inherent biases or systemic biases within the lending system and so forth. And zoning ultimately has also played a part in this. Historically, possibly more than presently, but there are still inherent biases and there are still inequities that occur within zoning. I want to point out, especially from an economic diversity standpoint, and I went back to the slide with the housing needs assessment, this doesn't have the total number of households at each income bracket. But what I want to make clear to the community, what this table does show us, is you already have a diversity economically, in the sense that you have households in all of these income brackets. And therefore, the lower half of the income brackets are as important as the upper half. And while you may have a larger number of households at the higher end, being a wealthier community within your region, you still have bracket households across all income levels. The one last comment I do want to make to further drive home the relationship between race and income. The median household income of a white family in America is approximately $72,000, and the median household income of African American families is around $41,000. I believe Hispanic families fall in around $46,000. There is a systemic disparity in income. The more we can address the affordability of housing, the better we serve minority populations due to the differences in household income. So I agree with the comments, race has to be confronted, but the better we address income, the more we address income and affordability, the better we are to address race. Other questions?
Yes.
Yes.
This is Carlene. I was going to question you on how you know that what our income is and what category to put us in. I just don't understand how you got that.
So the data is based on the U.S. Census. The U.S. Census actually asks you questions about income. They also cross-reference with other federal agencies like the IRS, and based on simple things like our zip code, not necessarily our personal ID, our name, or social security number, but in general, they know where we live. And based on that, the incomes of all tax filers within the same zip code can be averaged together, which they are, and redisseminated back as data. So all of these numbers are based on U.S. Census data, where they do, they update on a 10-year basis, but they also do sample polling and estimated updates for different categories. Some every 2 years, some every 4 years, some once every 5 years, and so forth. So this is all based on federal government data on income by location.
Okay, I have another question.
Sure.
There are 44 new housing that are not online and 82 proposed, which means another 126 units for this town of Stonington. specifically for the village of Pawcatuck. How would that affect our 5.61 housing, not the housing, but the 5.93%?
Right. So this is one of the challenges with the 5.93% is that the numerator and the denominator constantly change. That every time you add more housing, then the percent changes. And so just to say, and I assume some of that housing that's been approved, at least off the top of my head, what I know, and staff can correct me if I need to be, the wind development has an affordable housing component to it and is adding affordable units. So long as it's adding affordable units as a percent higher than the 5.93, then it will positively benefit that number. But if you are adding more non-affordable units at a higher rate than you're adding affordable units, then you can see that percent decrease.
Yeah.
So that's why that's why at the end of the day, just to say, if a community is trying to achieve 10% affordable housing, you usually have to require or allow 15 or 20% of housing units per year to be affordable. That way you can gain ground and increase that 5.93% number.
It just seems to me that not very many units within a project are actually affordable.
I missed that.
And these people don't have to follow zoning regulations. They can just come in and do whatever they want, and they get all these benefits, but we don't get the benefit of many housing to add to our affordable housing.
Yeah, and I don't know the specifics of the two developments you mentioned as far as the permitting process, but that section of state law called 8-30G was adopted in the 1980s, and basically it was the legislature saying if you don't have at least 10% of your housing stock as qualified affordable, then you're subject to this 8-30G provision that allows a developer to some extent circumvent traditional zoning, provided they are building at least 30% of the housing units as affordable. This is part of the reason, the frustration that many communities have had over 8-30G is part of the greater discussion that has gotten the legislature to realize that we have to start planning for housing, and the reason why these housing plans are now required, so that we as communities start looking at these issues and figuring out the best path forward for the community, so that state law in Hartford doesn't dictate 8-30G upon municipalities.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, a question here.
Sure.
Density generally is driven by transportation options. So this town grew up first around its rivers, and then around the train stations and that sort of thing, and now around the interstate. It seems to me that it dictates where affordable housing is deemed acceptable. I'm sorry, and where it can be reasonably provided, I guess. How do you sort of break out of that trap? I mean, are there other ways you designate places that are suitable for affordable housing that you ought to consider when you're developing a plan?
Yeah, so I mean, I think to just broaden what you said, you mentioned one infrastructure, and that's transportation. Other infrastructures are public water, public sewer. So ultimately, areas that are most served by a variety of infrastructures become the areas that are typically most suitable for affordable housing. So it's not just public water and sewer, it's also transportation. Auto-oriented, then we can say, versus public transport. And we have to, at the end of the day, and I'm not cutting you off, I'll let you finish. For a town like Stonington, we have to recognize kind of the limits that infrastructure poses.
Sure, sure. But that also leaves the people who live in the village of Mystic and the village of Pawcatuck feeling like they're bearing the burden, if you want to call it a burden, of affordable housing.
Yeah, and in some ways that's unfortunate. I don't want to sound kind of like unsympathetic or anyways. But in some ways it's part of your history. I mean, if you put it in the transportation context, you were the most accessible via water. You then became most accessible, via road. Your older history has, you developed at a point prior to zoning, at a density prior to what modern zoning typically shoots for and so forth. So there's kind of these aspects of your history that have made you more susceptible to it. I don't think at the end of the day, though, that means that this should be viewed as all affordable housing should be thrown into your villages. As I've said with staff and the EDC at this point, and as I tried to emphasize in this, these preliminary ideas in the questions, I look like I've frozen up. Hopefully you can still hear me. Exit 90 and exit 92 are probably really good locations for either mixed-use development or even standalone multifamily development. And while I know they may fall within what is the village boundary, they're not core to the center of any village. They're not Main Street in Mystic, per se, but still provide tremendous opportunities. Also, just looking at exit 90, you have some older properties, some older commercial properties there. They're probably due for opportunity may create incentives for investment. So I don't want this to come across that it's downtown Mystic, downtown Pawcatuck, and that's it. There's other areas.
Well, thank you. I have to leave, but I thank you for this. It's been very, very informative.
I thank you.
Keith, I have a question for Mr.
Sure.
This is Leslie Driscoll. There's at exit 90, you're speaking of that area, there is a trailer park there that has about 80 units, and they recently came before our architectural review board because they want to add another 8 units or 10 possibly. You can correct me, Keith. But only about 3 of those new units are deemed affordable. None of the rest of the trailer park is deeded affordable. So it doesn't figure into the calculation of what is affordable in our town. And then there's plenty of other housing in the town as well that probably qualifies as affordable, but it doesn't have the deed restriction. So
Yep.
I think that deed restriction is skewing our number in ways that aren't really accurate.
Yeah, so if you just look at my table here, this is really what you're seeing down here. Think about it. You have 374 more housing units serving populations with incomes of $15,000 to $25,000. That's what we call natural occurring affordable housing. And it's been one of the complaints as to how housing affordability is defined, that we only count government assistance and deed restrictions, that we don't account for that naturally affordable housing already within the marketplace. So yes, you are right that there's housing that's not being counted that make you look worse, to say it bluntly. At the same time, though, from a policy and planning standpoint, that then raises, the potential for opportunities. So part of, what starts running through my mind is how can you maybe get some of that existing housing stock that's not qualified affordable now, but is affordable to be qualified affordable. So it's hard to say to someone, hey, I want you to deed restrict your house so we can count it as affordable, right? But maybe, it then becomes a carrot. What can you do to incentivize them to maybe consider that? So something like a tax abatement, the willingness to abate taxes, a percent of or in full or whatever. So you could look at, an existing apartment building with 20, units, and maybe we can come up with a policy that says, and these are all affordable, that maybe we can come up with a policy that incentivizes the owner to recognizing these are all renting at 80% AMI and lower, that if they're willing to deed restrict them and keep them permanently affordable, then we as the community of Stonington are willing to offer a tax incentive, or maybe willing to offer some assistance on renovations through the housing trust fund that gets established, or so forth. So there's ways or tools for us to start thinking about this naturally occurring affordable and getting it into what is considered qualified. And at this point, I'm not saying that I have all the answers, but we'll hopefully find some opportunities through this process.
So that housing trust fund would be, for instance, to maybe incentivize the owner of a 4-family or 3-family Victorian house in Pawcatuck to maintain it so that the people living in the apartments there have a better quality of life in their house. I see a lot of degradation in some of these larger multifamily older homes that are very expensive to maintain because
Right.
they're old Victorians. So
Right.
maybe the town could do something to help those folks.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that would be a great utilization of a housing trust fund. I ran a neighborhood reinvestment program years ago in Hartford, and Hartford, like your community, has many old Victorians, and the numbers on maintaining some of those properties just get frightening when all of a sudden you have a home with 32 windows in it, and they're non-standard size, so you can't just buy a replacement, and all of a sudden it's $1,000 a window, and just doing windows is $30,000. You then throw the roof into that, and all of a sudden you see there's deferred maintenance for $160,000. So how can we structure a housing, trust fund to create an incentive for investment into that property? And maybe in return for the incentives that we give them, the revenues we give them to invest, we request that they provide deed restrictions going forward, and so forth. So we can look at ways to structure this to make it work for all parties involved.
This is Susan Cullen. Listen, I've got a comment in the chat, and I'd like to read it to you so that you could address it to the group, please. So
Sure.
in the chat from Mr. Thomas Mitchell, he had asked that Stonington's POCD calls for a more durable rental housing, which implies a degree of resiliency and energy efficiency. 2018 building codes address some points here, but affordable housing, especially at the highest need levels, has to be as durable, low maintenance, and energy efficient as possible. What is the mechanism for making that happen and avoiding low-cost construction?
Yeah, very challenging, but I can be honest and say that, especially if we go back to kind of the definition for unaffordability of households, that it's not just about the cost of rent, it's about the cost of utilities. And especially on older structures that don't have the benefits of modern building codes, modern energy efficiency codes, and so forth and so on, utility costs can be tremendous. I had a friend that owned a 3,600 square foot Victorian in Hartford, and when her and her husband bought it, their first January, they had a heating bill of $900. They almost died. Now, it was an exceptionally cold January, but we can see how energy efficiency can relate directly to housing affordability. So while in the moment, I don't have the specific perfect answer for you, what I can say, as I said with Leslie previously, is we can start looking at ways to structure policies that maybe it's not specifically about housing affordability, but it's how can we use a housing trust fund or a tax incentive to incentivize investments in existing properties to improve energy efficiency, whether that be through a locally created program or getting people into the state programs. How can we, create investment in housing that improves things like energy efficiency, which will drive down ultimately the cost of housing, whether it's being borne by the renter or whether it's being borne by the owner. Either way, that cost of utilities ends up affecting the cost of the housing. So we can look to further, develop that POCD recommendation into actionable strategies through this housing plan.
If you don't mind me adding a little bit to that.
Sure.
Some of my background involving housing rehabilitation programs and in making investments in properties that are talking a lot about what you're talking about in terms of making sure that we're not only making things affordable in terms of the rental or the owner's side in terms of mortgages and rents, but all in terms of energy efficiency and low maintenance. Some of these items actually go above the building codes. Some of the municipalities that I've worked for have had a rental housing code that was a different kind of code that went above the building code that really specifically addressed some of these items. I've also been very involved in processes with grant money that actually had a lot of these restrictions in terms of the level of maintenance and energy efficiency that was required to make housing rehabilitations appropriate for this type of housing, to make sure that people's utilities aren't being outstripped by their means. And so as far back as an internship that I did about, oh my gosh, it was almost 30 years ago, we actually went back to a historical home in Iowa City and talked to the folks who owned it. And really what was not affordable about it wasn't the rent, it was the utilities. And we brought in contractors and did an estimate for the owner of the property, talking about what could we do to make it more affordable. And because of the historic status of the property, it was very difficult to find a way to sort of retrofit it in terms of energy efficiency like you're talking about. Newer construction and newer building codes have much of these items, already built in. They're Energy Star rated, they're very efficient, they're very well insulated. But for older buildings, sometimes there are other things that, like you said, with the windows that make it very difficult to bring them up to today's standards for energy use. So that's something we can definitely work harder at.
Definitely. And just while I recognize the challenges of historic properties, at the very least, a program focused on getting attics insulated adequately. Just insulating an attic can go a long way to improving energy efficiency. And it's interesting, recommended insulation by building code is R30 for an attic. By energy efficiency standards, it's R56 to R60 for Connecticut. So not even the building code meets the minimums of what should be there sometimes. But I think this whole line of discussion, we haven't, as myself, the consultant, and working with staff and the EDC, we haven't had a detailed discussion about utilities as a factor of cost or energy efficiency. And I think this has just opened up an area for us to explore further from a policy standpoint for housing affordability. Anyone else?
Don, I've received another message in the chat
Sure.
that I'll read out to you. Susan Hibbard had asked, how do trailer parks fit into affordable planning given the high cost of new construction?
Good question. I can honestly say someone stumped me. I usually have an answer for everything. And to be honest with you, early in my career, and this is going 20 years ago now, I worked in a community where we had a number of trailer parks, and I was very up on the dynamics, the costs, and all that. And you asking that question, I've just realized I've become very distanced from that. I haven't experienced a lot of new construction in the trailer park world or the replacement construction, that I'm a bit out of touch with it. And I think it's something that we should delve into, since there are existing trailer parks, and also, just in general, consider them in the context of incentives, to reduce costs, or to at least get them drawn into being counted as affordable, if and so they are. So,
hi, I have a question.
sure.
It seems like utilities is the big holding point for more densely populated areas, meaning if you don't have septic and running water, town septic, you can't do anything. So would there be a way to somehow, and I don't know how, but say you had a 10-acre piece of land somewhere and you wanted to make affordable housing, but it didn't have town septic or water, could you do a community well and some sort of community septic system? And I don't think our town would allow that, but maybe it's time to think outside the box as far as those type of utilities are concerned.
Yeah, I don't want to speak for Stonington in this context, because I don't think I've had this discussion, but in general, my understanding, the greater barrier to that hasn't been the local resistance, but has actually been the state health code, that our state Department of Health and also our state Department of DEEP, Energy and Environment, haven't been very favorable as to community systems, whether that be well or septic. It appears that on a state level, there is beginning to be a realization of revisiting those codes, especially on the septic side, since modern package systems, design systems can be built at the community scale and be highly effective. So I think we see a shift in regulations beyond the municipality heading that way, which probably says that from a municipal standpoint, it's something to start at least thinking about and considering allowing moving forward.
Thank you. And I have one last question. So once your town hits the 10% level, does the 8-30G go away?
Theoretically, so long as you can stay above 10%, then the 8-30G provisions can't be used in the community. So you're no longer under the threat of 8-30G. The struggle for community just crossing over the threshold, though, is the fact that the numerator and denominator constantly change. So you need to kind of get above 11 or 12% to put yourself in the safety zone of not falling below again. But it basically means once you start planning for affordable housing and shoot for that, you just need to continue to be cognizant of it and continue to plan for it. I think the biggest challenge we're facing in Connecticut is the fact that, 30 years ago, the legislature basically said with a stick, plan for affordable housing or else. And I'm not sure we collectively took them seriously. And now it's 30, 40 years later, And everyone's going, oh, we didn't plan for affordable housing, and now we need to make sure everyone starts planning for affordable housing. So I think we're playing catch up to some degree. So. Susan, thanks for monitoring the chat. It's the thing I'm the worst with, and it's so funny. My students love the chat function. I forget about it, and then I realize I have 30 and 40 comments in the chat function. So, anyone else with a question or comment?
This is Keith. I have comments I received by email just before it started, so I'll just read those here.
Sure.
So, this is from resident Stuart Schwartzstein. He says that affordable housing should not stigmatize the residents by being easily identifiable, but neither should it equal in comfort, amenities, and advantageous location, e.g. waterfront scenic views, that for which the costs are much higher. Priority for affordable housing should be given to those who work in the community, particularly those engaged in essential services, and those who have lived in the community for a long time but find themselves without adequate resources to continue to live in the community. The housing should, to the degree possible, be close to public transportation and essential services, as well as within walking distance for shops, churches, community organizations. Where possible, the housing should be integrated into the neighborhood in which it's located. In many instances, mixed-use buildings should be used for affordable housing. For example, retail space on the ground floor, some office space above, and a mix of different kinds of residential space, including that which is affordable and that which is not. In the town of Stonington, the village of Pawcatuck is likely to be the best location, given that in Pawcatuck westerly, so much is within short distance. But to offset any sense that residents of Pawcatuck would see it as disadvantageous in locating affordable housing there, it should be offset by encouraging and even making profitable for a developer prestigious housing as well. So, I'm just picking up there on the priority for affordable housing, giving to those who work or live in the community. And just sort of wondering out loud, is there any sort of mechanism for the town to require that for a privately proposed and built development?
Yeah, I think that's an area we should delve into and look at. I recently came across I'm working on an assignment. So I'm a third-party reviewer for an application before a town right now. And in the developer's housing affordability plan, he's set out a priority for municipal employees for access. And I have a meeting tomorrow where I have a question posed. Do those priority systems risk running afoul of fair housing? So I think that's a question first to answer. And if not, then can there be a way of structuring incentives or programs favoring residents and so forth? So I think that's something we should look into. I also just want to play off of one of the comments about the, higher end housing that person made the comments about. I can't remember the specific comment, but shouldn't be shy about more costly housing or something. If you go back to the needs assessment and how I was showing you that there's far more households with high incomes than housing units available at high incomes. I recently did a housing needs assessment for a community about 2 years ago. In their POCD, we made the bold statement that while the community needs to focus on providing affordable housing at lower populations, that it should not be shy of encouraging high value housing at higher income levels. Because basically I had a similar finding in that community where there was far more income than there was valuable housing. And there's benefits to that. So you can kind of have a dual strategy going at the same time, that you know, encourage the high end while you provide for the low end. So.
I've gotten another question in the chat,
Sure.
and it says, wouldn't it make sense for a municipality to partner with a developer to construct a building development with a higher percentage of affordable units, greater than 30%? This would give the town greater control and a quicker route to the greater than 10% number.
Yeah, so that is a viable option. But it hinges on the partnering. How's the municipality going to partner? This is one of the challenges. You have to remember, at the end of the day, when we're talking about affordable housing and fixing the value of that housing, that means we're actually talking about reducing the net operating income of the development. Or to say it another way, we run the risk of undermining the financial feasibility of the development. I have argued for many years the reason why 8-30G hasn't produced as much affordable housing as it was intended, is because the requiring 30% of the units undermines the financial feasibility of actually building the housing. That the larger the amount of affordable units, the harder it is to make the economics of the development work. That's why I'm typically an advocate if towns are creating an inclusionary zone to incentivize. I typically recommend 15 to 20% affordable numbers, not 30% or more, because I think that becomes a barrier. So let me go back once again. If partnering on the town's part is for the town to put in money, or for the town to provide tax abatement, or for the town to reduce the overall fiscal burden on the developer, then yes, you can figure out a way to do it. But if it's just we're partnering in the fact that we're going to get a developer to build us some affordable housing, but we're not putting anything into it, 30% or more probably isn't going to work. So. Great question, though.
Okay, Don, there was a follow-up from Kurt that says, would accessory units, including detached units, provide homeowners an opportunity to both have an affordable housing unit as well as potentially making the original house more affordable?
Yeah, I think accessory units, whether attached or detached, are a great option to provide a diversity in housing stock and to provide an option that is more affordable in the housing market. That being said, in most cases, the accessory units aren't deed restricted. Therefore, they don't count as qualified affordable. Therefore, they just become part of that naturally occurring affordable housing. Now, that isn't a bad thing. I'm just being clear that they don't get captured. Once again, that opens up the opportunity. Can we create incentives, such as tax abatements or whatever, to incentivize owners to deed restrict accessory units at 80% AMI affordable? That may be something to consider pursuing. So.
I think I'd like to make a comment.
Sure.
Earlier in your talk, you spoke about the Pawcatuck section and the Mystic section, and this may not be the right place to throw out this idea, but I might not get another chance to throw it out. So I've been thinking that possibly Pawcatuck's name should be phased out and the town becomes Stonington. And we're not going to lose the Mystic section because that's the most famous tourist destination in the whole state. But, my kids grew up here and went to school at Dean's Mill and Mystic Middle. They became prejudiced against the subsidiary of Stonington called Pawcatuck. And I think that it would help property values and just overall attitude adjustment for the whole town if we didn't have all these little villages. And just throwing that idea out, it's maybe not the zoning that we're here for, but I wanted to say that tonight. Thank you.
Thanks, James. And probably beyond the scope of the housing plan, but I think that's great food for thought, and probably, some of those identity things, not just Pawcatuck, but on a community scale, may be worthy of future, community conversations. So.
There was a follow-up question from Kurt that says, does 30 units to be added? Now, I'm not sure if it means, oh, wait, he just added a detached deed restricted accessory unit.
Yeah, so provided that, so any unit, including accessory units, provided they are deed restricted to be affordable to incomes of 80% AMI or less, would ultimately be captured and counted by the state as a qualified affordable unit. That being said, I believe you as a municipality would have to report the unit to the state for it to be counted. Otherwise, they wouldn't know it existed. But yes, accessory dwelling units that meet the deed restricted income requirements would be counted.
John, let me just jump in there. Do that reporting. So
Sure.
Every summer, the town actually reports out to what's called the Affordable Housing Appeals Listing. And so we report out to the state all of the properties that fall within that definition. And we're required to say the location of those properties. And then we also have to let them know where those deed restrictions exist. So we keep a very specific and detailed list of those properties. And I often get asked, at what point do those properties get counted? So at the point where a certificate of occupancy is actually issued by the building department, that apartment, that home, whatever the unit is, becomes occupiable, then it counts on the list as being affordable as long as that deed restriction is in place. So we account for all of those every year, and every year we update that list so that it's as up to date as it possibly can be. We do that every summer.
Great, thank you.
I had an additional in the chat from Kurt that says, if someone is in an affordable housing unit, what happens if their income goes up and then exceeds the income limit?
Yeah, and I think there's a variable answer on this, and it sometimes is related to the terms of the unit itself. I had actually lived in an apartment building years ago, and my income as a municipal planner qualified as affordable. But it was based on the moment in time when I moved in. So actually, when I did the lease renewal the following year, my income had gone above the limit, but the property management didn't have to verify my income again on a yearly basis. So I remained qualified for the whole time that I stayed there over multiple years. So I think sometimes it relates to the specifics of the housing affordability plan for the development and how they're counted. There are other circumstances that I am aware of that income has to be requalified on a yearly basis, and it can become challenging. The other thing in the state definition, I'll just use it because it is important. In the state definition of affordability, CHFA loans count as affordable units. And those are so volatile in the sense that, you know, people buy and sell houses regularly and move in and out of town, that you can actually have substantial shifts or swings in your percent affordable based on the counting of the CHFA loans. So. Can you rent? Kurt's just full of questions here. Can you rent a unit to a family member under HF30G? Yeah, I would assume so, just so long as they income qualify, that the individual is income qualified. I don't see why relationship would matter.
And we have a question, I think it's actually to me, from Felicia Adams, that's units that are approaching the end of their affordability period. I don't know that off the top of my head, but I'd be very happy to look that up tomorrow in our listing and be able to get back to you about that, okay?
Great question. So, if I'm correct, we're approaching our witching hour. Would you want to field one last question? If anyone has one more question. If not, I would like to say, A, the conversation doesn't have to end here. Keith's email is at your disposal. Sorry, Keith. But seriously, as Keith explained that he received comments from residents, you know, before this meeting who couldn't attend. If any of you have any further questions or comments you'd like to convey, please feel free to reach out to town staff like Keith, who can pass those questions along to us. Number two is, I believe once we now work through some of the feedback we've received, the research we've done, and we start drafting this plan, I believe once we have a draft plan, we're going to bring it back out for public comments again. So please stay tuned for a continuation of this conversation at a later date.
Yeah, and if anyone has would like to comment by email, especially because people might be watching a recording of this, the easiest email address to send it to is dop@stonington-ct.gov. And if the comments relate to this meeting, it would be helpful to have them in about a week or so, just so we can have the comments related to this phase, and Don can start working on the draft affordable housing plan itself.
Thank you, Keith.
Thank you, Don. Thank you, Keith, for putting this on. Very beneficial. Thank you.
If anyone is interested in technical papers that Don was referring to as well, we did discuss each of those technical papers at EDC meetings that were earlier in the year, or if you'd like, you know, copies of any of that information, that can definitely be provided as well if you want to dig into the details of anything.
Thank you, Kurt. Appreciate all your questions.
Yeah, we really appreciate people tuning in tonight. And it looks like that's it. So good night, everybody.
Yep. Thanks, one and all.